Welcome to the CEC Report. It's November 16. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Martin Ferguson's Energy White Paper, Power to the Profiteers, Death to the People. Gold plating is a Nazi term. And finally, Benjamin Netanyahu is a fascist. So first, Martin Ferguson's Energy White Paper, Power to the Profiteers, Death to the People. Last week, Craig, the Labor Party, or the Labor government, released its Energy White Paper. They'd foreshadowed it last year, now it's official. What this white paper is, in effect, it's like a prospectus or a reassurance to the City of London, the financial money power around the world, that this government, the Australian government, now intend that from this point on they will scrap all the vestiges of Australia's tradition of the government building and operating electricity infrastructure. That's now all gone, and the whole system is handed holus bolus over to private financiers.
Yeah, Robbie, I wanted to jump in here because I think a lot of people will say, well, what's the matter with that? I mean, why not? I mean, this is the way things are going, isn't it? Well, I want to put it on the record that most people who think like that are completely brainwashed, and they've been brainwashed by the takeover of the idea of publicly owned infrastructure by an organisation called the Mont Pelerin Society. Now, the Mont Pelerin Society is a fascist organisation. It believes in pushing the ideas of privatisation of all public infrastructure whatsoever, busting unions, euthanasia, the shutdown of public education, all those sorts of things. Now, what's happened is back in the 70s, this Mont Pelerin Society, based in London, set up a series of think tanks that were spawned here in Australia. Things like the Centre for Independent Studies, the Tasman Institute, the Institute for Public Affairs. All these think tanks were spawned specifically to push this privatisation agenda. So what you have today is almost like a hegemony that the only way that you can run public institutions and public infrastructure is through privatised, privately owned corporations. So the whole vestige of publicly owned infrastructure, as was promoted by the Labor Party and funded initially through the Commonwealth Bank and similar institutions, has been done away with.
And it's not just the Labor Party. In fact, when they made decisions, say here in Victoria, to build the power infrastructure here 100 years ago, it was Conservative governments who said that the government should do it, right? It's just that these think tanks you're talking about, a lot of them have been, like the IPA, have been associated with the Liberal Party. This policy that we're talking about is a Labor government's policy.
And that's what makes it even more hideous, because
they've gone over to the dark side,
yes,
if you will. They basically say, I'm going to give some excerpts, Craig, from the executive summary of the white paper, where the bottom line is that the only role that they intend the government to have in the future is to fix the market so that the private owners can rake in enough profits to keep them investing. So here's the quotes. Meeting Australia's future energy needs will require significant levels of investment over coming decades. And they say that by 2030, that's about $240 billion, right? So how will this investment need be met? Quote, our ability to deliver investment in a timely and cost-effective way will depend critically on access to finance and capital. Given the relatively small pool of Australian investors with deep experience in greenfield energy investments, it is likely that a significant proportion of the required capital, debt and equity will need to be sourced from overseas. Now, that's just false. We could, with a national bank, finance all the infrastructure we'll ever need in this regard.
Well, Robbie, what was the profits of the banks this year? 25, 26 billion?
Yes.
Right, and this is on the back of a privatised Commonwealth Bank. This is why the Commonwealth Bank was shut down in the post-Chifley period of the 1945-46 period, because it actually demonstrated that when you have a national bank, right, which is how the Commonwealth functioned, it wasn't strictly a national bank, but functioned very close to it with the regulations that they had in there from the war period, that if you controlled the capital within the economy, and you had the ability then to use that capital and direct it towards public institutions, $25 billion private money right?
Exactly.
It's literally being sucked out of the economy. That's not just over a period of 10 years, that's every year.
Because the thing is, when we say Commonwealth Bank, we do not impose on that equation the need for a massive return that's basically usurious, like 10+% interest. Whereas when they're talking about private finance, they factor usury right into that equation, and of course everything becomes expensive. So what they go on to say in the white paper is that they have no intention of going with national banking. The government will grease the skids of the private finance so that it becomes a palatable prospect for them.
And it sort of becomes a catch-22, because look, these private corporations are funded by superannuation funds. Superannuation funds require a return to the people who invest in these superannuation funds. That return, they're not looking for 0.5% or 1% interest, Robbie, which is what, at a maximum, just to cover administrative fees, you would have for a national bank. They're looking at 8, 9, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%, or even higher. And
in order to meet that, they've got to gouge the people, the working families who are wanting that return through their super.
Yeah.
The summary says, the footloose and competitive nature of foreign capital means that Australia must maintain attractive and stable investment and policy frameworks, particularly if the current turmoil in international financial markets is sustained. This includes ensuring that energy markets provide opportunities for fair commercial returns. And to me, Craig, that's the nub of it. Labor is selling out. It isn't enough just to hand electricity over to the free market. They intend to fix the market so that these pirates are guaranteed their profits.
It all sounds very nice at the moment, Robbie. What's going to happen in 10 years' time? I mean, what is actually going to happen when these private companies have to then, replace, massive infrastructure? Well, what will happen is the price of electricity will go out of the reach of ordinary people, and ordinary people will literally die.
And they're not going. A lot of the electricity infrastructure is not going to be replaced.
No, of course not.
Craig, one of the problems with this particular issue now is that we can point to cases in recent history like Enron in the United States and the California electricity crisis, where it emerged, it was found out after it happened that a company like Enron had been calling up power stations, getting them to shut off so that they could create power shortage, they could force the market up and they could profit from that, right?
Yep.
We do not, no one knew that was happening at the time except Enron. It came out later. Under a deregulated system, like they want to impose across the whole of Australia, we wouldn't know whether that's been done to us right now.
Mm. And look, Robbie, I wanted to introduce in the next segment, Mr. LaRouche's triple curve function to show that this is all got to do with the looting of the monetarist system.
Yep.
That the idea of publicly funded infrastructure by a national bank, a government-controlled sovereign national bank, can actually provide infrastructure much, much cheaper than anything in the private sector, because you don't have this usurious profit motive locked in. And so what this government is doing under the guise of globalisation and that's this horrendous policy that is literally destroying countries like Greece and Italy, Spain, as we see on the news, this is the policy that's coming to Australia. This is the policy and it's working. This white paper is setting the groundwork for this very same policy. Right now it's all rosy and we can do this, because people don't understand that there is an alternative, and this policy that's been foisted on Australia is a foreign policy from the Mont Pelerin Society. We go through it in our in our publications and point out the direct, like for this flow chart, for example, why this has taken place. So people don't have to be sold a pup on this. This is a foreign policy, and it's designed literally to shift the profits, which should be reinvested as a matter of course into the public realm, into private hands.
Yep. All right, well, why don't we go to a break, and when we come back we're going to talk about that under the subject heading of gold plating. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And Craig, we're talking about electricity privatisation and the federal government's new energy white paper that Martin Ferguson has released. The title of this segment is Gold Plating is a Nazi Term, because what's happened, Australians are being bombarded with this line that the cause of the price rises that we've all been suffering from in terms of electricity is over-investment in infrastructure. They're spending too much money on the physical infrastructure of wires and poles, and that over-investment is called gold plating. Now, I want you to you've obviously got a lot to say on it, but before I just did define gold plating more for the viewers. Gold plating doesn't just mean investing for a future need that we don't have yet. Because bear in mind, once upon a time, people thought it was a hallmark of sanity to think about the future and make investments for the future. Now we don't do that. That's too expensive. But it's not just investing for the future. They're calling investing now for contingencies now, such as hot days where you have a heat wave and a lot of people turn on their air conditioners. That is also gold plating. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to say on this, Robbie. First of all, when you say it's a Nazi term, this whole debate about electricity privatisation is killing people. Go back to February in 2009 in Adelaide. 60 people died because of the heat wave there. They had several days of over 43 degrees.
And they were the power companies didn't have enough electricity and they were load shedding. The reason they didn't have enough electricity, just quickly, is because they hadn't built it, and instead they'd ran an extension cord to Tasmania, and Tasmania was going to provide it, and the cord failed.
Yeah, and at the same time, in one hot period that we had here in Victoria, over 3 days, over 1,300 people called for ambulance assistance. So if you keep
374 died in Melbourne.
Yeah, so you had you have this this direct correlation between the lack of cheap power and people dying. So it's not a myth. But look, this all comes back to the problem that gold plating is seen to be something bad. Like you said, it used to be that we had the best possible infrastructure to meet all contingencies. But if this was funded through public means, through Commonwealth Bank, and so forth, you could afford to do this. But under the monetary system now, the intention has been to loot public infrastructure. And as I mentioned before, you've got to go back and people need to look at and study what Mr. Lyndon LaRouche put out in 1994. Mr. LaRouche, of course, is a physical economist. He's just celebrated his 90th birthday, but he has also put out a series of forecasts, economic forecasts over the years that have never been surpassed. And this is part of his 9th forecast. And the importance of this graphic, Robbie, is if you look at the bottom curve, that's what we're talking about here, and you see how that's collapsing in sort of like a hyperbolic way. That's the physical economic outputs of your economy. It includes things like all forms of infrastructure, but also all sorts of manufactured goods, physical goods, right? Not services so much.
Physical investments you make.
Physical investments. But you have two other curves there. One is the financial aggregates. Now these are the things called derivatives, the shares, the stocks, the financial instruments within the economy. In the last 40 years, since the deregulation system, these things have gone up to completely blow out the financial system. I mean, you've had an increase in derivatives alone of something like $1 quadrillion. These things didn't exist 40 years ago.
And what it's done is it's driven, the financial aggregates have gone up sky high, and that's reflected in the price on essential physical commodities. We're now paying through the nose for everything because that's actually what they're looting.
Yeah, there's a direct correlation between the cost of the shares, the prices of superannuation falls into this, in that it's actually demanding profits out of the physical economic side of things, of the infrastructure, and putting that into the hands of private peoples. Now, the system itself collapsed in 2000 when, in fact, they couldn't actually fund the returns on financial aggregates. The only way to do this was literally crank up the printing presses. And under Alan Greenspan, they literally began to print money. And that's what you see with qualitative easing 1, qualitative easing 2, qualitative easing 3. You see this sharp rise in the red line there, which is the literal hyperinflation of the monetary supply.
And one of the reasons is because they're getting less and less blood out of the stone of the bottom curve.
Yeah.
And they have to make up for it by printing money.
And so you end up with hyperinflation within the system. So what we're talking about here with the gold plating is that this is the looting. Instead of having infrastructure that can survive, okay, so it sits there for all but 4 days of the year. Who cares? It's reliable, it's stable. You're talking about not just poles and wires, you're talking about things like transformers. And in many cases, these transformers, Robbie, aren't available these days to be just replaced overnight. They're not being manufactured. It's part and parcel of the takedown of the physical economy. So, I mean, if you take our operation here, our political operation, where we've got 25 computers, we've got servers, you've got air conditioning, you've got people on the phones actually working, that would devastate us to lose power for 4 days, right? But that's not factored into the equations of those that are trying to make money from the electricity. We have to wear that cost, but there's a real physical cost to being able to provide the wages to the people that work here to be able to do what we have to do. Now, we're just one institution. Multiply that across the economy. This is used to be a manufacturing sector. It's still got a few manufacturing businesses here. If they lose power for 4 days, right, because of the failure of infrastructure has been downgraded, because we're no longer gold plating, we might be maybe zinc plating, maybe tin plating, I don't know. But the point is, the fact is you've got a less reliable capability. The loss of production in real terms, in real physical terms, is not factored into this argument.
It's a much bigger expense than anything they're talking about. Craig, what they're doing now, and the Energy White Paper is explicit about it, is their intention. You've just described that loss of production. We see that as an economic catastrophe. They see that as a positive thing because that reduces demand, right? Shutting down aluminium smelters reduces demand. And if they can reduce demand, then that can allow the private owners, electricity companies, to keep raking profits from what they've got without having to invest in more energy, in more infrastructure, right?
Yeah, just quickly, Robbie, the point of the LaRouche's triple curve is you have to compare that to LaRouche's double curve, where there's only 2 curves. The first is the literal increase, the uptake, not a hyperbolic, but a steady uptake in the development of physical economic output, which is the quality infrastructure and more goods particularly being manufactured. That has to be financed with financial instruments, because you're still going to have loans, you're still going to have banking system, but there's not a third curve. The monetary curve doesn't exist because your monetary control is controlled, or your monetary emissions are controlled strictly through the government, so you no longer have speculation in the system.
Well, in other words, it can work much, much better. None of this we're talking about is necessary. But back to the Nazi theme that we started with, I just want to read for the viewers how explicit they are in targeting the poor and the elderly and the low income with their agenda. So this is what they say. The main drivers of the growth in inefficient peak demand are the increased use of relatively low-cost, energy-intensive domestic appliances such as air conditioners and large-screen TVs, and inefficient pricing structures. Current electricity pricing does not reflect the true cost of generating and supplying electricity at various times of the day, and so fails to provide a critical financial incentive for more efficient behaviour. As a result, some consumers are likely to be paying more than they otherwise should, and are effectively cross-subsidising those who are driving the growth in peak demand, i.e. having the temerity to turn on an air conditioner. And so their solution is...
Which might keep them alive.
That's irrelevant to them, Craig. Their solution is price signals, i.e. smart meters. They introduce it by saying this: protecting the interests of vulnerable consumers must be part of any reforms in this area. So that sounds nice, but it's a lie. Because how will they protect the vulnerable? Not by shielding them from price rises, Craig, but by targeting them with price rises using the technology of smart meters, so they all have to pay those higher prices. Quote, this includes recognising the varying ability of consumers to access programs and information and shift usage patterns to respond to price signals, and understanding that communication may be needed through a range of channels to reach the intended audience. And what's so explicit about this is when they get the prices up so that people aren't going to want to turn on the air conditioners, that's not going to affect the rich people. They'll still turn on their air conditioners. This is explicitly to price electricity out of reach of poor people. And this is a Labor government.
Well, that's what we said before. These are Nazi-type policies. Now, there's no excuse for it whatsoever.
No, absolutely.
Labor government.
All right, so we're on the warpath here, people can probably tell, but we have to go to a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about an international crisis involving Benjamin Netanyahu. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a fascist. Craig, we've had this war erupt in Palestine overnight. the trigger was 24 hours, just 24 hours after Egypt brokered a ceasefire between Hamas, which, remember, for whatever people might think of them, they're the elected government of Palestine, and Israel. So they brokered this ceasefire, and 24 hours later, the Israelis, Netanyahu, killed one of the top Hamas leaders. And it was one of these, pinpoint strikes. They filmed it, and they put the film footage of the killing up on their Facebook page, right? And so consequently, all hell has broken loose. Now, we want to emphasize, we want to sort of, you got to see Netanyahu for what he is by comparing him to what Israel and the Middle East could be if there was a better approach. And I want you to comment on that. But just for the benefit of the viewers, we understand a lot of people, because of the history, a lot of Jewish people are very sensitive. And there's a habit of making that they don't like people making comparisons between modern atrocities that happened and the Holocaust, because they say there's no moral equivalence. Well, by the same token, when they talk about rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel, there's no military equivalence between what those glorified firecrackers can do and the conditions that the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, are subjected to, with 80% youth unemployment. They live behind a wall that the Israelis built, etc. And it's a living hell for them anyway, and it's breeding extremism, it's breeding terrorism, and it just doesn't have to be that way. We've just put out our, and there's a timing question here of this as well, because right now in front of the UN is the question of Palestine's statehood.
And this, I'll say, Robbie, happened back 4 years ago, straight after the US election.
Exactly.
Again, the same thing happened, that there was a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In
our latest New Citizen, Craig, which people can read, we have an article on Michael Danby. And in that article, we highlight a fact that relates to this. Michael Danby is one of the big advocates of war that we're trying to expose here. He's a follower of a notorious Israeli named Vladimir Jabotinsky. Now, this guy was notorious because the founding father of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, called Vladimir Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler, right? Danby, the Australian politician, calls Vladimir Jabotinsky much misunderstood. Benjamin Netanyahu's father was Vladimir Jabotinsky's private secretary. Now, who can we contrast Netanyahu to? Well, take Yitzhak Rabin, who genuinely sought peace in the early 1990s and achieved it, and he was assassinated by extremist Israelis for doing it. Netanyahu, on the other hand, in claiming he's protecting Israel, is actually keeping Israel as a pawn for the kind of British imperial games that keep the Middle East on tenterhooks. Craig, this guy is just begging to be the fuse for World War III, but tell people what's the real alternative here?
Well, Yitzhak Rabin, back in the early 1990s, was actually fighting for an equivalent plan that Lyndon LaRouche had put on the table back in the 70s, called the Oasis Plan. Look, Robbie, the solution to this is not to get into the details. We can't do that right now for time. But the problem is that we have to look at a broader policy of peace through economic development for the entire world. Our entire world currently is run by a policy of monetarism, free trade, privatisation, British free trade actually, and globalisation. We have to get out of this policy and move back to the idea of national sovereignty, sovereign for sovereign national states, and peace through economic development, large-scale economic development. Nothing else will work, particularly with water projects in the Middle East, is absolutely crucial. But unless we start looking in that direction, there are no solutions.
Because they're the things that raise living standards, and only that becomes the foundation for a peace. And if they're not doing that, and they don't, then it's not going to happen.
That's right.
Anyway, read our latest New Citizen again for on that, but there's plenty of other stuff on our website. But that's it for this week's CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in.